Recently, I spoke to someone that had uploaded one of their photographs to Chat GPT and asked it to give them an honest critique. I must admit, it both scared me and intrigued me in equal measure, and I knew that I was going to have to try it out for myself. So I decided to upload a photograph to the chatbot that I'm reasonably pleased with to see what it thinks of my photography. And in this video, I'm not only going to share with you the results, but I'll also give my honest opinion on whether I think ChatGPT is a useful critiquing friend to have, or whether it's just another robotic voice in the crowd. So this is the photograph that I've decided to put forward for critique. A photograph of a cabin in the snow on a moor not too far from where I live. So let's type in, give me an honest critique of this photo. Let's see what comes up. This is a striking image with a strong sense of isolation and moodiness. Here's an honest critique. Strengths: composition and minimalism. The placement of the small cabin in the vast snowy landscape creates a strong focal point. The surrounding emptiness enhances the sense of solitude. Good so far. Colour grading and atmosphere. The cool, muted tones of the sky and snow contrast well with the slightly warm glow of the cabin's windows, creating a subtle yet powerful emotional impact. Lighting and depth. The soft light and gradient sky add depth, making the image feel immersive and almost surreal. Interesting. Although now it's buttered me up, I can't help but think there's a but coming. So, as I nervously scroll down the screen, let's move into the areas for improvement that ChatGPT constructively calls it. First of all, foreground texture. While the snow and rough terrain add interest, some areas feel overly processed or slightly artificial in texture. A more natural look could enhance realism. Secondly, cabin details. The cabin could benefit from slightly more sharpness and detail to make it stand out even more against the landscape. And finally, sky gradient. While the gradient sky is beautiful, the transition feels a bit abrupt in some areas. A smoother blend between dark and light tones could enhance realism. It finishes off with a little bit of a summary, which in the business is known as the closing slice of the praise sandwich. So let's see what it has to say. Overall, this is a visually compelling image that effectively conveys isolation and mood. With a few refinements in texture and blending, it could be even stronger. So, as the photographer of this photograph, how do I feel receiving this critique? To be honest, I think it's done quite well. I like the fact that it's picked up on those feelings of mood and isolation, because that's definitely what I was going for when I took this photograph. I also take the point about getting it to be a little bit sharper in detail. When I took this photograph, it was going into blue hour and the light was fading and I didn't have my tripod, so it meant that I had to open my lens as wide as it would go. So that's obviously been picked up on and it's feeling a little bit soft in certain areas of the photograph, which I can perfectly take on board and see that as a potential improvement that I could make. In terms of other areas for improvement, it's picked up on the texture in the foreground, saying that it looks slightly over-processed. Now, I did add a little bit of a vignette to this photograph just to darken the corners and draw your eye more centrally, because I thought that if it was white right to the edges, it might not have the effect of drawing you in as much as it possibly could do with that extra bit of darkening. So yeah, I can see that, yeah, it has been processed, and for ChatGPT's liking, then it might be slightly over-processed. And it also picks up on the gradient sky, where it says that the blending could be a little bit more subtle. What I didn't tell ChatGPT though is I call this photograph halo, which is very much about the shape of light in the sky. And what I wanted to get across through this photograph is not only the isolation of the cabin, but also the salvation that it might provide as we are walking through this bleak landscape and suddenly coming across this area of shelter. So in order to get my intent across for this photograph, I feel that a more subtle blending wouldn't necessarily work. I think it would take a little bit of that edge off. But of course, this is what photography is all about. It's all about subjectivity. And what one person thinks is right, another person might think is wrong. So everything that we receive in a critique, we've got to take with a pinch of salt anyway, which leads me on to my next point. The way ChatGPT works in order to build these critiques is by scrolling the internet for similar sort of photographs and finding out what other people have said about these pictures. So we get this very generic sort of style of critiquing where it sees a landscape photograph, so therefore it brackets that into the landscape category and says this is what a landscape photograph should be based upon what you've done within the image. And that can be a little bit detrimental. So what I've decided to do is try and give ChatGPT a little bit more information. So I'm going to redo the critique, but this time give a little bit of a photographer's statement rather than just that simple phrase, give me an honest critique of this photo. So let's see what that comes up with. This time I've decided to write, this photograph of a cabin in the snow is called halo, picking up on the strong gradient of light in the sky. The cabin does not only show off a sense of isolation, but also salvation from the moody conditions. A subtle vignette draws the eye centrally and the footprints in the snow guide us toward the cabin. By using a shallow depth of field, I've tried to isolate the cabin in the bleakness, softening some of the harsh textures in the foreground snow. Are there any ways in which I could improve this photo? So instead of being quite airy-fairy and vague, I've now told ChatGPT what I want people to get out of this photograph. So hopefully it should give me a little bit more of a constructive, more directed critique. I'm actually really intrigued to see what it has to say here, so let's dive back in. Your photograph already conveys a strong sense of solitude and atmosphere, but here are some potential ways to enhance it further. Firstly, composition and leading lines. The footprints leading to the cabin work well, but if possible, you could refine their placement in post-processing or when shooting to create an even stronger path toward the cabin. If you shot multiple angles, experimenting with a slightly lower perspective might enhance the sense of depth and vastness of the landscape. Secondly, lighting and contrast. The gradient in the sky is beautiful. Oh, thank you, ChatGPT. You might enhance the glow around the cabin slightly to intensify the halo effect, emphasizing it as a beacon of salvation. Increasing the contrast between the warm window light and the cold snow could deepen the emotional impact. Thirdly, texture and depth. You mentioned softening the foreground snow. If you want to enhance depth further, consider selectively sharpening the middle ground closer to the cabin to create a smoother transition from soft to crisp textures. Adding a bit of mist or atmosphere in post-processing might reinforce the moody, isolated feel. Finally, colour grading. If you want to heighten the mood, you could play with subtle colour adjustments, perhaps deepening the blues in the sky while adding a slight warm tone to the cabin. Experimenting with a slight split toning effect could emphasise the cold versus warm contrast. I think it's really interesting, now I've given ChatGPT a little bit more information about my intent, how much more directed the critique is. It's also interesting that in the first instance it was saying that the textures in the foreground were overproduced, and now it's referring to post-production to enhance the photograph further. I think this neatly highlights two of the most important things when we are receiving a critique, whether it's from a chatbot online or a real person. Firstly, the more information we can give as photographers about our intent for that photograph, the more the critiquer has to go on, and the more constructive that critique should hopefully be. And secondly, because photography is so subjective, we shouldn't necessarily think that everything that we receive in a critique is absolutely spot on and we must carry it forward in order to improve our photographs. Instead, we should pick up on the little bits that we feel are relevant. There are certain things that ChatGPT has said in this critique that I think, yeah, I could try that, like a lower angle or maybe a bit more split toning between the cool and warm tones of the photograph. But there are other things that I think, actually, I don't really want to do that. I like the way that the photograph is. Things like realigning the pattern of the footprints in post-production is just going a little bit too far for me. At the end of the day, this was the scene that I was met with, and I don't really want to manipulate that too much out of recognition. And I also think where it said try brightening the highlight in the sky, that might have the effect of drawing the eye too far up and away from the cabin, so that's something that I would probably give a miss to as well. So I suppose the question is, would I recommend using ChatGPT to critique your photographs? And I have to admit, I'm actually surprised by the answer that I'm going to give you here, and it is absolutely yes. I think that ChatGPT offers a very constructive and at the same time reasonably objective critique. Sometimes if you ask people to critique your photographs, it's very much based upon their opinion, whereas because ChatGPT has got this vast database to work from, it picks and chooses what it thinks is relevant for you. I must admit, before I started this little experiment, I thought it'll be interesting to try, but it's probably going to be a waste of time. It's going to come back with lots of generic comments that aren't necessarily relevant to me as an individual photographer. And I suppose when we gave it that initial "can you critique this photo" statement to begin with, that first critique was very much like that. But it goes to show the more information we can give, the more of our intent for a photograph that we can share, the more directed and more honest that photograph critique becomes to us as individual photographers. As long as we remember that everything that we do in photography is our own choice, and a critique doesn't dictate what we should or must be doing, we just pick and choose the bits that are going to help us to progress as individuals, then I think this can be a really, really useful tool. So much to my amazement, I think I'm going to continue using ChatGPT to critique my photographs, just to get that more objective perspective. I think we can often get entrenched in doing our own thing a little bit in photography and forget about what other people think of our photographs. And when you ask somebody to critique your photographs, especially if they're on the same level as you, then they might feel a little bit threatened by you. Think, oh, this person's photographs are really good. I'm going to give them a bit of a bad critique here to knock them back into place. ChatGPT isn't going to do that. It's going to probably be the most honest critique you receive. So with that, I'm going to try it again and see what I come up with. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.